Welcome to Out of the Ether with Brandon Hardy. Spooky season has started. That means we're a little behind, but I had to make a pit stop and do a little research. This is one of my favorite cemeteries in the area, so I wanted to come here and take a look around, see what lessons there were to learn before I start building my own new graveyard. There are a lot of different things to notice, from the size and shapes of the different tombstones, to how close they're placed to each other, angles they hang over at, all of which contribute to the amazing atmosphere. So come on, what are we waiting for? We're going to start with the easy project here, which is taking a store-bought tombstone and transforming it to make it look much more realistic. I'm starting with a plastic vacuform tombstone that I bought from Spirit Halloween. I don't have any problem with the sculpt of this tombstone, so we're just going to focus on giving it a great new paint treatment. I'm starting with a can of spray-on wall texture. This is like what you would use to create popcorn ceilings. On the back of the nozzle, there's an adjustable dial that lets you change whether it sprays in a fine or heavy pattern. I always start by doing a little test spray off to the side to make sure that it's coming out the way that I want, and then I just took the spray and went straight at the tombstone and gave the whole thing some nice coverage. You may notice that I'm spraying with an up and down motion rather than a side to side motion. That's because the grime on a tombstone always runs with gravity. So horizontal lines would look strange and out of place, but any vertical lines that show up are just going to add to the aging effect. I also made sure to get the sides and the top of the tombstone. You can see I'm not going for complete coverage here. You still want the background to show through, so just think of it like painting a snowstorm. If at any point you feel like you've done too much texture, you can go in with a paintbrush and just sort of tamp it down. You can also pat it with a paper towel. That said, as it dries, the texture will flatten out a little bit, so I'm not worried about that. For the next step, I used a can of textured desert sand spray. The cap has the texture on it so you can feel it. I give the entire tombstone a coat with this spray. My focus here is not necessarily on giving the entire thing an even coat, it's just making sure that everything is coated at least a little bit. This spray is essentially a clear coat that has little bits of sand-like texture in it, so having a little clear coat all over the tombstone will help protect it from the weather if you display it outside. Already you can see here how much of a visual difference this spray makes. Basically, the original color of the tombstone becomes the lowlights, the wall spray becomes the highlights, and then the sand spray creates a middle ground between the both of them. You can see that in some places I'm spraying heavier than in others, letting those vertical lines form, and in fact I sprayed so heavily in some places that I just let the textured spray totally drip down the tombstone, which when dry will only add to the aging effect. Once again, I made sure to cover the sides and top of the tombstone. It's really important not to forget that. And speaking of forgetting things, I meant to sand down this little plastic seam here, which if I was gonna do it, I'd needed to do it before I started spraying anything on the tombstone. So I'll just make sure not to put this at the very front of my graveyard where I think anyone will notice. Then I took a spray bottle filled with water and mixed some black and brown acrylic paint into it. You wanna use enough acrylic paint that when you shake up the liquid, it doesn't run clear. You want the drips to be saturated with color. I used that spray and a separate bottle with just water and went back and forth spraying the tombstone with each of them. And by the way, because I think I didn't say it, I waited until the textured desert spray was dry before doing this step. I let my coverage with this spray be totally uneven and splotchy because nature never provides an even coat of weathering. This step is all about building up layers, so I'm just going back and forth with the different spray bottles and letting the water sort of do its thing. If there are any deep recesses in your tombstone, you want to make sure that you get in there with the dark paint. But if there are certain places you want to guarantee that you have a highlight, you can just take a paper towel and spray it with some water and wipe those parts back down. However, I really do think for the most part, it's best to just let the paint go where it goes because that's kind of how things really work in nature. Another thing that can be true in nature is that the bottom of a tombstone tends to be darker than the top of a tombstone because that's where all the dirt gets kicked up. So personally, I like to go back towards the end of this step and give everything a dark wash in the lower parts of the tombstone. Additionally, if at this point you feel like there are any details from the sculpture of the tombstone that maybe have disappeared a little more than you like, you can go back in with that paint and a tiny brush and help bring those details back out. On this tombstone, I only did this for the face. I then repeated this whole process with a couple different store-bought tombstones. I tend to prefer, personally, having most of my graveyard consist of original scratch-made tombstones, but the quality of tombstones you can buy in the store has improved in recent years, and in some cases they already produce a tombstone that I would have otherwise had to make from scratch anyway because it's from a movie or property that I really enjoy. And then honestly, in some cases, if I'm doing a really big graveyard, I'll just pick some up to use as filler to help make the space feel a little more full. But all the more reason I like to give them a custom paint job and make things feel more cohesive. I was recently gifted a couple amazing plastic statues. These are already in pretty great fake gnarly shape, but I still wanted to do a little something just to help bring these all together. I wanted to get rid of some of the fake moss on here just because I wasn't sure how well it was going to hold up once I did the surface treatment, and I found that just scratching it off with a sanding block worked pretty well. I also discovered that it was mostly attached with hot glue, so just heating it up with the heat gun and then pulling it away also worked. But just be careful because if you heat it up too much or you stay in one spot too long, you could deform the plastic, so the sanding block is ultimately what I used the most. The plastic for the statue is kind of a light gray, so I went and gave it a base coat of a darker gray before I started doing the texture. This really helps bring out the dimension of the sculpture. The deepest recesses of it are the parts that are hardest for the wall spray to get into, so ultimately it kind of creates some forced shadows that make it look even more spooky. I'm just repeating all the steps that I did on the tombstones, but when that was all done, I did give everything a light dusting of black spray paint from the bottom to help make those shadows even more dramatic. This second method is a really simple way to make tombstones from scratch. I'm using sheets of Floracraft foam that I bought at Michael's. These sheets are 1 foot wide, 27 inches tall, and 2 inches thick, so depending on how you like to work, these may be on the smaller side for tombstones, but that makes them easier to store, and I like to use smaller tombstones further back in my graveyard to create the impression of more depth. I'm starting out by drawing the design of my tombstone using blue Sharpie. Now, you don't have to use a blue Sharpie, but I recommend that you use one that isn't black, and you'll see why in a bit. For this tombstone, I'm replicating one of the designs from the graveyard in the Haunted Mansion. For something like that, you could take a projector and project a photo of it onto the foam and just trace that, but for me it just felt faster to freehand it, and I feel comfortable doing that. If you're ever freehanding lettering, here is a good tip. You can literally block in the word by drawing a rectangle where you want it to be, and then draw a line down the middle of that to be either your center letter or your center space, depending on whether the word you're writing has an odd or even amount of letters. Then I start from the middle and work my way outwards. This is a simple way to help guarantee that everything's going to be centered. Once that's all done, then I take a black Sharpie and go over any lines that might have been questionable the way that I drew them the first time. That way, before I go to make any cuts, I know which line I'm really supposed to follow. Sometimes things get sketchy when you're roughing things in, or like me, you just put some of the letters too high and don't realize till later. So this is just a simple little trick that gives you a nice safety net. Because Floracraft foam is pretty soft, you can even use a pencil to engrave the different letters. Over the years, I've used different tools for this. Sometimes it's just a matter of grabbing something nearby that happens to have a point. Pens, pencils, screwdrivers, sculpting tools, there's kind of no limit. It doesn't have to be sharp, it just has to have a point. Depending on how particular you are about the lettering on your tombstone, you can get through this pretty quickly. Like I said before, this tombstone is inspired directly by a tombstone from the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland, so if you're wondering why the inscription doesn't make any sense at all, that's why. But with that said, I'm not particularly worried about this being perfectly legible, and sometimes it makes a tombstone look older when it's not completely legible, so I move through this pretty quickly. To cut out the shape of my tombstone, I'm using my jigsaw, which is absolutely way more firepower than you need for something like this. Like I said before, this foam is pretty soft and easy to cut through. In the past, I've done this part with a serrated kitchen knife, and that works great. However, since I have a fancier tool and it works fine, I figured I might as well use it. I've decided to make a small batch of Floracraft tombstones, so before I move any further, I'm just gonna go and replicate the steps that we've done so far to get a couple more started. This tombstone is also a replica of one from the graveyard at the Haunted Mansion, but to be clear, these two Floracraft tombstones are based on tombstones from the interior graveyard at the Haunted Mansion. Later, we're going to do one from the exterior graveyard. Once again, I'm going in and blocking in the words by starting in the middle. If you know you've got the middle part of your word centered on your project, the likelihood that you're going to have the whole thing centered goes way, way up. Especially because from there, you can divide up the remaining sections and just sort of block out the letters individually like that. It's just a great, easy way to center things without having to trace. For this next tombstone, I'm going an even simpler direction where instead of trying to write anything super specific on it, I'm just kind of gonna cheat a little bit and create the impression of some words that have worn away. I'm not writing anything in particular. I'm just kind of creating the general idea that there was once text on this tombstone and that it's just been roughed away with age. For this, you can see I'm using the Sharpie, but I haven't taken the cap off. I'm just kind of making an impression with the rounded edge, and it sort of gives the impression of a worn down engraving. Then for this next sheet of foam, I'm gonna get clever and get two tombstones out of it. I'm looking at some pictures that I got of broken tombstones and drawing a jagged edge across the foam and cutting across it diagonally so that each remaining half of the tombstone can become its own broken tombstone. A good idea when you do this is to go back and cut one of the edges to be a little bit different so it doesn't look like you just have two halves of one broken piece of foam. And then I'm just gonna beat up those broken edges using my hand and using the pencil to go back and sort of create some lines. And then I'm taking that pencil and engraving half of a date on here. So it looks like the top part of the tombstone with the more advanced engraving is what broke away. This is a great way to create additional tombstones for your graveyard that solve a couple problems. They're faster and easier to make, they save some money on materials, they add a sense of age and realism to your graveyard, and if you're the kind of person who writes funny inscriptions in all of your tombstones, you just saved yourself a couple puns that you'd have to come up with otherwise. Not that what I think the world needs is fewer puns, but, you know, Halloween showing up whether we're ready or not. Chop chop. It really is valuable when you're creating tombstones like this to have reference photos that you're working from. You don't necessarily need to make a design that exactly replicates what you see in the photo, but it definitely helps add a level of realism to know that there's something out there that looks kind of like what you're trying to do. But if you're doing what I'm doing here, which is trying to make something that looks like a tombstone from something else, yes, you definitely want to be looking at photos of it while you're working. I keep an entire album of tombstone reference photos on my computer. Keep an eye out while you're engraving to make sure any excess bits of foam get kicked out of your lettering. Also, maybe wear gloves or you're gonna end up with Sharpie on your hand. By the way, earlier I mentioned a serrated kitchen knife for cutting this foam. You can also just use like a regular hand saw, you know, normal people tools. Using that excess foam that I just cut off, I'm tracing out some of the parts of my design that are gonna be raised on top of my tombstone. Part of what I appreciate so much about Floracraft foam is how easy it is to cut and carve. Here I'm just referencing the sketch that I did on the face of the tombstone itself to make sure that I'm getting roughly the same dimensions out of the piece that I'm gonna put on top of it. I made a point here to take sort of an assembly line approach with these different tombstones where I would do each step on each one and then just kind of go down the line until they all had the step addressed. You can make a bunch of these tombstones really fast when you go through the steps like that. Pro tip, when you're hot gluing stuff and the new glue stick won't stay in the back of the glue gun, a tiny dab of hot glue will make it stick to the end of the old stick. To layer these pieces of Florifoam, I just hot glued them directly onto the tombstone and then used the pencil to shape them properly. Because of the texture of this Florifoam, it takes hot glue really well. If you have a lot of Florifoam to shape and you're looking for the easiest way to do it, a Sureform shaver like this works great. As dumb as it sounds, it's like a cheese grater on a stick. There are a lot of different uses you can get out of this tool. I used this exact same one to tatter all the costumes on my Flying Sanderson sister puppets, so they can serve a lot of purposes, but of course the main one is for shaving things down like this. And while using that, I also went in some places with my handy dandy pencil. Both of these simple tools combined give you the ability to put a lot of detail into your tombstones without a lot of money or a lot of effort. Sometimes as you carve, it can be helpful to go back and redraw the parts of your design that you may have already carved away. If you're someone who isn't used to working in a three-dimensional medium like this is definitely something I would recommend to help sort of keep tabs on how things are turning out. Then I'm just using the pencil again to make those details in the face. I hollowed out the eye sockets and traced out the mouth and the eyebrows. Honestly, you could probably do this whole project with just a pencil if you wanted. Another method that you might find easier is to shape the different pieces of foam before you attach them to the tombstone. This can sometimes let you get at different angles that are maybe a little more difficult once it's glued in place, and it also kind of gives you a little bit of a backup system where if you don't like how a piece turned out, you can just take another piece of foam and try again before you glue it down. Because this piece has some tight corners in it, I'm coming in with an X-Acto knife just to try to get them as sharp as possible. The X-Acto knife isn't long enough to cut all the way through the foam, so I kinda have to break the pieces off after I've scored them. So if you go to do that, just be careful because you can accidentally break off a piece that you didn't mean, like I just did here. Thankfully, Fluorofoam is so forgiving, and really all I have to do to fix this is just hot glue the piece back in place. Because I'm replicating tombstones from the Haunted Mansion with this method, I'm trying to make them look as close to the ones in the ride as I can despite the time constraint that I have, which is to say you can crank out really great looking Florocraft tombstones without putting in as much time and particular detail as I'm trying to do here. Which is also not to say that these are like so intricately detailed or anything like that, but you know, I'm being a little picky about my process. Again, this pencil really is the MVP for this project. I didn't even sharpen it or anything, like it's just kind of doing it naturally. By the way, Sureform shavers work on a lot of different kinds of foam. I made a point to try to tap out all the extra foam dust from the lettering and bits that I'd carved off. You don't have to be perfect, but it's worth shaking off. Then I used that pencil to carve in some natural looking cracks. Here I'm using the pencil to round over the edges of these pieces of foam that I glued down to the top to create sort of a trim, and then I'm just using my fingers to press it the rest of the way and sort of break it up and make it look a little bit more jagged and uneven. Because the texture of this foam is already so naturally tombstone-like, you can sort of go and put in as much or as little detail as you want and still get a really great result. Tap, 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 tap. Then once everything's carved up and I like how it's looking, I take some gloss house paint and cover everything. You don't have to be super particular about what kind of paint you're using. There's no one brand or anything like that that's necessarily best. The main things to remember are that gloss paint will give you a really great watertight seal, and if like me, you're planning on using your tombstones outside, you want to make sure that somewhere on the can it says exterior paint. Maybe interior paint would work fine for this too, I'm not sure. It didn't seem worth taking the risk to find out. With this paint, I am being as thorough as possible, trying to get it in every single little crevice on this tombstone. Don't be shy, feel free to give it a really generous coat. If you find that the paint is pooling a little too much in your lettering, you can go through and take the edge of the paintbrush and sort of pull it back out with a jabbing motion like I'm doing here. And if it's being really stubborn, you can take a paper towel and just sort of let it absorb some of that paint. That said, it kind of depends on how important legibility is to you. This is another moment where the assembly line method really comes in handy. I'm just using one bucket of paint and one paintbrush and going down the line and getting all the tombstones at the same time. By the way, in case you don't know, the kind of brush that I'm using here is called a chip brush. They're really inexpensive. You can get them in different sizes and they're not precious. If you want to check and make sure you're getting complete coverage with your paint, you can hold it up to a light and see where the light bleeds through, and then just paint over it. Once that base coat is dry, I'm gonna do what we did last time and come in with some acrylic paint and some spray bottles. I'm just mixing in some black and brown acrylic paint, and I'm almost certain I used more than you just saw me put in there, so keep that in mind. Something that's good to know too is you can always go back and add more acrylic paint if you feel the need, and I just mix it up directly in the bottle by shaking it really vigorously. You can tell that the paint is thoroughly mixed in with the water if you look at the bottom of the bottle and don't see any clumps of paint. Then I do a quick test spray to make sure it's coming out of the sprayer the way that I expect it to. For these tombstones, I started by spraying the whole thing down with just plain water before I went in with any actual paint. This gives the paint in the other sprayer bottle a bit of a medium to sort of seep through as it drips down over the tombstone. These tombstones in the Haunted Mansion that I'm replicating here have some spots that are particularly dark, so for those I just took this black acrylic paint and went directly in with a brush and made sure that they were really, really dark. You can see I'm not being particularly fussy or anything, I'm just trying to get some of that dark paint in there. While those spots were still wet, I went in with the sprayer bottle that was just filled with water and broke up some of that darkness and let it drip down the tombstone in a totally organic fashion. At one point I decided I wanted the paint that I was spraying to have a little bit more color to it, so I just mixed some more in, and after a couple pumps of the spray, it came out much darker. Then I took that same brush from before and did a little bit of detailing in the face just to bring out some of the features. Look at the way this paint drips through the water. I love it. As I said earlier, the trick here really is just to build up layers. In painting a tombstone like this, you're essentially doing a time lapse of how nature works, condensing years of dirt and grime and water and rain running down the face of this tombstone into a short window of time. Where a real tombstone acquires its age over decades, we're doing all of this in like a couple minutes. But that's why I recommend using water to your advantage like this. It lets you get essentially the thumbprint of nature's patterns into your project without having to fake it with a brush or waiting dozens and dozens of years. That's part of why I'm painting these standing up so that the gravity takes over, but you can also, if you prefer, paint them laying down and let that paint really settle onto the face of the tombstone. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of both methods just to give myself some variation. Now, the most involved method of tombstone making that I'm going to show you today is the pink foam method, which takes a little more time and a few more tools, but ultimately these tombstones will last you a really long time. I'm talking more than a decade, like you will get your money's worth. So I'm starting to map out my design on this pink foam, which is insulation board that you can get at basically any big hardware store. It comes in different colors sometimes. Pink seems to be the most common, but it also comes in blue and purple and green. All of them will work just fine for this. Part of what's so nice about this foam is you can get it in really large sheets, like 8 feet by 4 feet. That basically gives you the freedom to make any size tombstone you want. In this case, I'm using foam that's 2 inches thick, and I don't really recommend going any thinner than that. You can maybe get away with like 1.5 inches thick, but the thicker the foam, the more substantial your tombstone will feel. As you can see, I've been mapping out the text here in Sharpie. I don't know why I'm using a black Sharpie, I'm forgetting my own advice. And in this case, I'm replicating one of the exterior tombstones from the Haunted Mansion. This one is Grandpa Mark's tombstone. That tombstone is so called as an homage to Imagineer Mark Davis, who designed many of the characters and gags for the ride. I feel like I'm kind of underselling him a bit. If you don't know Mark Davis, take some time and look him up. The man was a genius. As you can see, I'm once again just freehanding the design here, but if you have a projector and you want to map things out that way, that totally works too. I cut it out of the foam using my jigsaw, and now I'm using the sanding block to sand down that edge. The Shoreform shaver is the best for shaping this kind of foam, but you will want to sand it down afterward. In terms of engraving, there are 2 methods I endorse. The first method's really simple. You just plug in a glue gun, let it get hot, and then use it to trace the letters. I tend to hold the glue gun upside down while I do this. I find it's easier to trace the letters that way. It may get hot, and you may want to wear a glove, and you may have to trace the letters a second time, but it works. The second approach is just to use a Dremel. With the right size drill bit, you can just carve out all the letters individually. It takes more time. You have to be careful. You have to be patient. You can make a mistake doing this, but if you go slow and you make sure that you do your lettering just right, it'll be really clean and it'll last you a long time. They make certain attachments for Dremels that you can use to make it easier to engrave something, but I don't have one of those, so I'm just going by hand and being really careful. Once that's done, you want to brush all of the dust out of your tombstone. There's a little detail in this tombstone's design that I almost forgot, but I was able to take my Sureform shaver and square it away. But you can see the edge is rough, so again, you want to sand that down. Then I take a bucket of joint compound, which is used for sheetrock. With this, I'm taking a big chip brush and covering the entire tombstone. There's no need to be shy, just glob it on there. This is going to be what provides the stone-like surface texture. While brushing this on, I make sure to get it inside all the little crevices that we carved out. You want to make sure that you get the sides too. I don't know, is that just me? I feel like I have a problem forgetting those. If at any point you feel like you've laid it on a little too thick, you can always just take either a pencil or a stick or the other end of a paintbrush and go in and scrape it back out. Really, the only time this would ever be a problem is if you feel like you can't read what you carved in anymore, so, you know, you want to make sure that you protect your hard work. Then after you've brushed on a nice layer with the chip brush, you're going to take a masonry brush and tap down all the joint compound with it. At first glance, this might seem like an extra or unnecessary step, but look at the difference in the texture that you get between a chip brush and a masonry brush. The chip brush looks like little waves in the ocean, but the masonry brush looks like stone. Again, if you make tombstones this way, they're going to last you for years, so it's worth doing them right. There's also something really therapeutic about this step, so it's an extra bonus. Like, look at that texture. Come on, that's beautiful. Here's another pro tip. If you've only used that chip brush for joint compound and it hasn't really gotten messy, you can scrape some of that back into the bucket and save it for later. I let the joint compound dry, usually overnight, and then I came back in with the same house paint that we used on the Floracraft tombstones. In retrospect, I maybe could have saved myself a step by using a dark gray house paint instead of a white house paint, but whatever. I went in with the acrylic in the spray bottles and then also brushed some black acrylic paint directly into the epitaph. Because I spent all this time carving that design, this one I want to make sure is definitely legible. I'm making sure that I get a heavy coat of black paint inside the letters, and then the rest of it I'm just kind of smoothing over the rest of the tombstone just because I don't need any of that to be as dark. If I really wanted, I could go in with like a paper towel and wipe this paint away, but I kind of like having a darker base coat to start from with this tombstone. In fact, I liked it so much that once that paint was dry, I came back in with some black spray paint and accentuated the tombstone with some even darker areas. I can do this because the house paint and the joint compound create a protective layer over the pink foam, but spray painting pink foam directly is not a good idea because the solvents eat it. Once that was all dry, I went back to our method from the store-bought tombstones. I hit the whole thing with a blizzard-like layer of the orange peel wall texture. Then I came in with our desert sand texture spray and made sure to give the whole thing good coverage. This particular method for texturing a tombstone is something I created only sort of recently, and I have to say I really love it. Not only is it a quick and easy way to get a lot of layering on your tombstone, but you can also get a finish that at times looks like granite or lichen without needing a lot of skill to produce it. I tend to be confident in my ability to paint things to look the way that I want, but when you're trying to teach people how to do different things, it's good to be able to come up with something simple. After that, it once again became a matter of just layering paints with the different spray bottles. I try to make a point to distress express each tombstone I'm working on in a different sort of fashion. So some are lighter, some are darker, some have more drips, some are more legible, some are less legible. Having that sort of visual diversity creates the impression that this graveyard went up the way real ones do, one tombstone at a time, as opposed to the way it was actually done, which is somebody making a whole bunch of tombstones in one shot and then putting them all up in one night. By the way, what I was doing here is just painting in these letters to make sure that they're really legible. I still want it to feel sort of naturalistic, so I'm making sure that I don't completely black them out with like just solid paint. I made sure the tombstone was wet before I did this, so that way you still get some transparency, and then also some of that black paint may run out of the letters and create the impression of more aging, and I think little details like that really can make the difference with your graveyard, because at Halloween, I think people know that when you see tombstones on someone's front lawn, they're fake. So whatever you can do to be subtle and add some nuances that just happen to be really authentic, I think it just kind of puts the question a little bit more in people's minds about whether these tombstones are a decoration or not. Perhaps even more important than the tombstones themselves is the atmosphere that you create in your graveyard. I have a couple different style lights that I like to use. In fact, this one you can see is a Christmas light that I've commandeered for Halloween purposes. Spirit Halloween used to sell lights like these, and they don't seem to anymore, so now Lowe's does. So I buy the white ones and add colored lighting gel to make them more spooky. I also set them up in and behind plants so they cast these long, broken shadows. I set the lights up first thing and cast them over the area I'm going to be setting up my graveyard, and from there I'll put in stand-ins for my tombstones. Over the course of this year, I've been slowly building back up my collection of fake pumpkins, and they're perfect for letting me get a sense of my placement before I hammer in any of my tombstones. You don't have to use pumpkins, but I recommend that you use something that you have a bunch of that's easy to pick up and move around, and that you can rest your tombstones on to see how they're catching the light and if you like how they're placed within the area, because a lot of these tombstones are flat and they won't stand up on their own until they're hammered in. This is the perfect opportunity to play with the angles of your tombstones and find out how to get the light to hit them just right. This is another moment where I think it's a really good idea to look at reference photos and see how the tombstones tend to be clumped together in the pictures that you like. And again, don't be afraid to do things different ways in different parts of your graveyard. You can have parts where they're spaced out and parts where they're clustered together. Also, don't be afraid to try things like this, where you cut the bottom of the tombstone at an angle so that it looks like it's sinking into the ground. Little bits of staging like that help make the whole graveyard look like it's been there for years. Also, don't be afraid to reposition the lights as you go. Things like that are sort of the main benefit of this pre-staging moment. You can step back and see how everything's gonna look once it's all set up properly, but you have the freedom to make any sort of change you want. Once you start hammering things into the ground, that's going to get a lot more annoying, so I suggest you figure things out up front. Something that I really like to do with my lighting is set it up at the extreme left and right sides of the graveyard. I like to use the light to create as much drama as possible, so lighting from the extreme sides creates really theatrical shadows, and I make a point to use different colors. The lights on the left look like orange street light, and the lights on the right look like moonlight. Then, once I'm liking how everything looks set up, I take a bunch of wooden stakes and a big old mallet and get to work installing the tombstones. You can use a hammer instead, but from experience, it's a lot more likely to split the wooden stake, so maybe invest in the mallet. I basically just set them up right behind where I had the tombstone positioned and hammer it a good, healthy bit into the ground. I'll double check from the front that I like the angle it went in at, and then I'll move on to the next one. This sometimes is also a moment where I'll decide if I'm gonna use the pumpkins as part of the display. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It kind of depends on the vibe for the graveyard that year. But of course, if I don't use them here, I'll use them somewhere else. Then I take my drill and some long-ish screws and screw through the stake down into the back of the tombstone. You want to be careful here because you don't want your screws sticking out of the front of your tombstone and ruining your hard work. That's part of why I angle the screws down. Also, I find it sort of clamps them in place and makes it less likely that the wind will ever blow them away. And then sometimes I'll just tap the stake with the hammer a little bit just for extra security. So now we got the tombstones, we got lights, we got pumpkins, we just need fog. I made this really simple fog chiller out of a storage bin. I cut 3 holes in one side and then 1 bigger hole in the other side. The bigger hole is where you're gonna put the fog machine, but don't put it right up against the bin. Have it set back an inch or 2. This lets more air in and lets the fog propagate. Then fill the bin with ice, or if you're hardcore, dry ice. I was short on time, so I didn't get to paint the storage bin, but normally I do that, put a statue on top of it, and then make sure it's out of the light. That way it's less obvious where the fog is coming from. The ice cools down the fog and keeps it really low to the ground, which creates this beautiful, mysterious river-like effect. If you're having the fog running for a long time, eventually the ice will melt and you'll have to replace it. Otherwise, that low-lying effect will go away and the fog will just start to float up like regular fog, which is still cool, but all the more reason not to put your machine in the middle of the yard. Put it off to the side like this so it drifts in. Usually I'll set up 2 fog machines, one off to the left and one off to the right, so that way no matter which way the wind is blowing, there's still a good chance it's going to drift across the graveyard. hope you've enjoyed this episode of Out of the Ether with Brandon Hardy. I think we're off to a good start celebrating the spookiest season of all, but of course, no graveyard is complete without something to haunt it. So next time, we're going to see what we can do about that. I also have a big secret project in the works for Halloween that nobody knows anything about yet, and I cannot wait to show you. It truly is one of the biggest projects I've ever done on my own. But until then, happy haunting.